Good morning, my beautiful students. So let's go and get started. This is an article, it's by the Washington Post, and it was adapted by NewsELA staff on 11/2/15. Now, even though this is a 2015 article, the issues that are stemming out of China is that at one time they did have this one-child policy, which caused a lot of problems for future generations. What that means is that you had a lot more boys than you did girls because a lot of people preferred to have had boys instead of girls. And, one, they wanted to keep the name in the family, but two, they needed a boy to become the patriarch, as I guess as you should say, as would be the probably the best way. There were a lot of, China is all about culture, but it's all about having the male being the leader of the family. So whereas in the United States it's a little bit different because we're constantly not forcing, but we're trying to let people know that women have just as many rights as men do, and women are just as powerful in the workforce and in education and at home just as men do. So where you have to start using your social studies caps here is where you start to think about, wow, how different the culture is in other parts of the world. So with China, they were highly populated. They were very dense. They had just way too many people in certain areas, so they had to enforce this policy called the one-child policy. Now, over time, it ended up causing a lot of problems because if you think about it, you have the families that over time they start aging and aging and aging, and it starts affecting the workforce because now you have less people working, even girls, right? You have less people working, and the elders eventually need to retire. So that is what we're going to be learning about this week. I think that, some of you may be familiar with China's one-child policy, and then we'll learn about did they ever change it. So there's a lot of interesting information. So let's go ahead and get started. The name of the article is called China Worried About Aging Society, Lifts Laws Limiting Families to One Child. So if you're following along, we are starting right here. Okay? All right, here we go. Beijing, China. China has dropped its one-child policy, which made it against the law to have more than one child. Now, all couples will be allowed to have 2 children. The change was announced on Thursday. China's leaders have become very concerned about the country's aging population. The number of elderly people is growing quickly. China's government worries that there could be far too few young workers in the years ahead to take care of them. Population growth led to 1980 policy. China's one-child policy was introduced in 1980. At the time, China's leaders were worried the country's population was growing too quickly. They were afraid of having too many people for the country to feed. The policy rules were loosened somewhat in 2013. So let's go back and think about that. So that's kind of like what I was talking about at the beginning of the statement, where you have to think about it. They have a lot of people. We know that China, in various parts of China, they have more of a poverty state than they would in certain parts of China where more people are either middle class to higher class. So there's a lot more poverty than there are middle and high. And, so if the government starts to worry about, okay, so how am I going to feed all these people? They're highly densely populated. They have way too many people. The responsibility has to rely on who? Usually the government, right? So you have to think about how the government has this huge responsibility to take care of its people. So the best decision is, of course, let's lower the population by enforcing this law and making a one-child policy. Now, many things happen because of this, and I'm gonna probably add some videos that you can watch on how it affected the girls and the boys and what people were doing. Now, I'll put those videos in the extension activity, so you could just watch them at your leisure. They are not It's not an assignment, it's just something for you to look at. All right, so let's go to the next page. Wang Pen is an American expert on China. He and others have warned for years that the aging of China's population could cause serious problems. Right now in China, families have an average of 1.4 children. The United States and many other countries have more than that. When two parents have two children, then a country's population stays the same. If families have less than two children, the number of people goes down. I mean, that's just a given, right? So, if you have a family, they have two children, it's going to remain the same, right? But if you limit them to one, then you are not going to have as many people. So if it remains the same, then it just keeps going up and keeps going up. So then those children have children, and those children have children, and each one has about two, but there's years in between, right? But if you have one child, what if all those children are boys, right? Think about that. If all those children are boys, where's the future, right? So this is where the problem came in. All right, so let's keep going. Now low births causing different problems. China's low number of births has led to several problems. Compared to earlier times, a much bigger share of the Chinese population is now elderly. The government has been forced to spend extra money on caring for them. The other serious problem is that the number of young workers has been dropping. China needs many young, healthy workers to keep its factories and companies running at full speed. The country could lose much of its wealth if too few people are working. Think about that. If you don't have enough people working, then the government is not making money, right? So think about that. All right, so let's go down to the next part. Change will take years to see, experts say. China's experts say the ending of the one-child policy is an important step in the right direction. However, they say it would take years for the effect of the change to be seen. Wang called Thursday's announcement great news. However, he said China will have to live with its population problems for many more years. China's working population fell for a third straight year in 2014. The number of workers dropped by 3.7 million to 916 million. The number of young workers is expected to continue dropping for years to come. Even with the new rule change, it would take time for the added number of children to grow old enough to get jobs. And China continues to age while waiting for babies. Meanwhile, the number of people aged 60 and above will reach 400 million by the early 2030s. At that point, they are expected to make up a quarter of the population. People 60 and above now make up about a seventh of China's people. The one-child policy was first relaxed in 2013. When that happened, couples were allowed to have a second child if either parent was an only child. In the countryside, couples were already allowed to have a second child if their first child was a girl. The earlier change did not lead to much growth in the number of births. Many families were simply used to the idea of having only one child. Some families were also worried a second child would be too expensive. So let's think about that. So before the law went into effect, nobody was thinking about, well, now if I have too many children, now I'm not going to be able to afford it. So maybe I'll just stick to the one-child policy. It's not a policy anymore, but I think I'll just continue doing that. Whereas in the past, they just had children. They didn't think about that, right? But now that they got used to having a little bit more money, they start to see that, wow, okay, having a little bit more in our pocket, or it's now affordable to feed our children, they start to rationalize the options, right? They start thinking, well, I don't know, maybe I should do it or maybe I shouldn't do it. But this is happening a lot more than we think. A lot more people are starting to use their thinking caps and starting to realize it's a lot easier to take care of a small amount of family than a large amount of family. Okay, so now China's population is starting to grow again. We're in 2020, but again, these kids are still young and the workforce is aging. So we have to start, or they have to start thinking about how are they going to balance this. All right, so we'll continue to learn more about it. I hope that you found this interesting, and we'll continue learning more about it over the next week. All right, thank you.